Welcome, everyone. I'm Ian Skerrett. I'm from the Eclipse Foundation, and I really appreciate you guys, everyone attending. This is the first time we've done this type of event at the Googleplex, and we've been very pleased with the turnout and the response. And so thank you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a brief introduction of kind of the day, and then we'll jump into the first presentation. So first of all, again, Rob did the introduction, but this is all being sponsored by the Google Open Source Program Office, so we really appreciate their support on doing that, just for the facilities, the refreshments, and so we wouldn't be able to do it without their help. So that's been a great community support from Google. Just my brief commercial for Eclipse. So Ganymede, our release train, is coming tomorrow. So this is our annual release train. If you want to check out the latest bits from eclipse.org, there's the URL. It's going live tomorrow. 23 projects, basically doing their annual release. I often get asked about how to get an Eclipse shirt. We actually have a contest going on right now called Ganymede Around the World, encouraging people to blog about what they like about Ganymede. If you do a blog about what you like about Ganymede, we'll send you an Eclipse shirt just like this. So if you ask me, that's going to be my response. It would be great to have some blogs written about this event and what you liked about this event too. So if you go to the eclipse.org website, there's details on that. So that's my brief commercial. For the agenda, I think we've got a great agenda, great number of speakers. We're going to have a main tent session with Michael from eBay, talking about their use of Eclipse at eBay. And then we're going to split into two different rooms. There's another room called Ames Monument just next door. Unfortunately, the rooms aren't equal size, so we did our best to try and kind of split the sessions. The other rooms are a lot smaller, so it might get too crowded in there, but there's always going to be good sessions in here too. But we'll leave it up to you guys to decide which rooms you want to go to. The way we're going to run this is we're going to have about 10 minutes break in between each session, and then a longer break around 3:50, around 4 o'clock. So if you can quickly move, if you need to move rooms, quickly move to the next room, and we'll have some time for the speaker to set up. But because we've got a full agenda, we're going to try and keep to it as closely as possible. And certainly at 6 o'clock, we'll have time for lots of discussions. We're going to set up some demos too of different interesting Eclipse technology to take a look at too during the reception. So without further ado, I present Michael Galpin, who is a software engineer at eBay and has actually done a number of articles about how eBay is using Eclipse. So I thought it would be really interesting for him to come and talk about what they've been doing with Eclipse at eBay. So Michael, all yours.
Okay. Thanks, Ian. Yeah, so as Ian mentioned, I work at eBay. I also do a lot of freelance writing, especially for IBM. And last year, I had some folks at IBM said, you know, what are some really interesting things that people are doing with Eclipse? And I told them, you know, every day I see a lot of really interesting stuff because what we're doing at eBay, we do a lot of great stuff with Eclipse. And fortunately, the powers that be at eBay were very happy to take the opportunity to show off what we're doing at eBay so that the rest of the world can, you know, maybe learn a little bit from what we do. Okay, so sort of the agenda for the talk, I'll talk a little bit about the history of eBay, just because it really leads to our current architecture, kind of how we got there, and some of the challenges that architecture creates. And I also want to talk about our organization at eBay. And essentially, our architecture and our organization, they're pretty unique to us. And they create some very unique problems for us. And we've been very successful using Eclipse to address a lot of those problems. Okay. So eBay started back in 1995. It was originally called Auction Web. Little known fact. It actually started on Labor Day weekend of 1995. And our first architecture was called, in hindsight, we refer to it as the V1 architecture. Of course, at the time, it was just, this is how we built the site. And it was a Perl-based architecture, right? It didn't even have a database. For data persistence, it was just file storage, just simple flat files being used to store things, right? So, not very sophisticated, as you might say, but it, the business idea took off pretty well. And eBay saw a lot of rapid growth, right? And our whole Perl and file-based architecture wasn't really holding up too well to that. So we came up with another architecture that was officially called the V2, version 2, very clever name. So it was a C++ backend, so pretty much all the Perl was removed and everything was rewritten in C++. Instead of having a flat file system, there was a single database being used. Actually, I guess it was really two databases in the sense there was a master-slave type thing. I don't really count that as being multiple databases, though. For our front end of the technology, we were using XSLT, right? So pretty much every request into our system would lead to an XML file being created in C++. And then an XSLT processor would transform that into HTML. So back in the mid-late 90s, we thought this was a pretty sophisticated architecture, right? Pretty clever use of XML, and XSLT was pretty cutting edge, we thought. So that held up pretty good for a while. eBay in the late 90s experienced exponential growth, and our site really felt it, right? We had some notable outages where CNN would show up saying, "Hey, why is eBay having problems?" Right? And so that led to a new architecture, a Java-based architecture that pretty much replaced all the C++. The only thing that stayed in C++ was our search. People don't think of eBay as a big search site, certainly not compared to some other well-known search sites. But we actually do a lot of searches every day, and we have a constantly changing data set that we search on. So that was written in C++, and that still is in C++. But pretty much everything else was written in Java. And by writing things in Java, it made it a lot easier for us to split databases, to scale our site across thousands of databases. Right? Some folks think that relational databases can't scale. We would beg to differ. And doing things in Java also let us do a lot of aggressive caching strategies. We have our own messaging layer for making a lot of things asynchronous. We've gotten in trouble before because of that asynchronous nature, right? We once got sued because people said that when they listed an item, it didn't appear on the site as fast as they wanted it to, right? Because it's an asynchronous process. It takes about a minute or so for it to appear, but some people want instant gratification. So for the front end, we didn't change anything, right? Instead of C++ classes creating XML files, we had Java classes creating XML files, right? So we just left that completely as it was. And we had some growing pains by keeping things that way. So most of these are growing pains that probably any really large website would experience. It's when you have so many assets that you're managing, it's easy to lose an image in the mix or get the path of an image messed up and have broken images on your site. It's a very embarrassing thing to see, right? But it happens. As our site became more interactive, there was more and more JavaScript being used, and so more and more JavaScript meant more and more JavaScript errors. As we scaled to 33 languages, that became a big challenge too. Localizing XSL, really localizing any kind of template-based presentation technology has a lot of challenges, right? And as the world kept moving forward, and became this notion of Web 2.0, right? There was a lot more pressure on us to make our UI more modern, more interactive, to use things like Ajax and Flash to increase the user experience, right? So mixing that in with XSL, sometimes kind of scary, right? So along came another architecture, the V4 architecture. And this is about 2 years old. The V4 project started about 2 years ago. So where we used to have XSL, we got rid of that and replaced it with Java. In fact, where we have any kind of templating at all, whether it be HTML or you can imagine other template solutions like PHP or JSPs, we got rid of all that and we replaced that with Java. CSS, as our site grew, we made more and more use of CSS, right? And we got rid of that too, though, and we replaced that with Java. You might see a pattern here. JavaScript, what do you think we did with that? Well, actually, we kept that around. We like JavaScript. But we wanted some Java on top of it to make us feel better about it, right? So in short, we love Java at eBay. I mean, we really love Java. So I like to say that V4 really brought a lot of the philosophy of the Java programming language to web development. Okay, but Java is not a silver bullet. It doesn't solve everything, and it presents its own set of problems it introduces. So if you look at eBay.com, everything you see there is in some way or another Java in our system. That means everything is code, right? So an image, that's a Java class for us. A static link, like a link to a help page, right? That's a Java class for us. Oops, sorry about that. What else we got? CSS. So that's actually several Java classes for a given CSS file. JavaScript. We have JavaScript, but for every piece of JavaScript, there's also Java classes corresponding to that JavaScript. For content, we didn't go with your resource bundle approach that a lot of Java guys would favor. We have a little more complicated system, and so content, that's also Java classes. So that could be a lot of code to write. I mean, can you imagine if every time you wanted to introduce a new image on your site, you had to go write a Java class? Right? Every time you wanted to create a new link to a help page or whatever, it's a new Java class. Right? So what do? Well, we use Eclipse. Right? Instead of making developers have to write all this Java code or abandoning this architecture and saying, well, let's go back to the days of just random strings representing everything, we use Eclipse to do all the grunt work for us, to do all the hard parts that would normally make our developers go insane. So we use a lot of code generators, right? So when you have a CSS file, I don't know if you guys can you see it pretty good? That was a .css file, right? You could create one of these guys, and in Eclipse you can right-click on it, and you get a context menu that recognizes it's a CSS file, and lets you generate lots of Java code for it. JavaScript, same thing, right? Take a JavaScript file, you can right-click on it, you can generate JavaScript for it. You can also validate, make sure that what you're going to do is going to work. We use essentially some meta programming on top of JavaScript to introduce Java-style types, right? So we can say this particular JavaScript function, it has these 3 parameters, 2 of them are strings, one's an integer, and it produces this type of object, right? And we do static, compile time checking of that, right? So of course, sometimes you could screw up the meta programming on top of the programming itself, right? So you can do some validation. Content, same thing. You might notice here that we have over here this survey.4cc. That's a content contract for us. It defines what you have to give our system for it to produce a localized piece of content, right? So some of the ways this is more complex than your typical resource bundles is sometimes for a particular string, there may be, depending on the language, different types of data you need to determine that string, right? So some languages have gender in them. Other languages don't, right? So for some languages, you may need 3 input values. Maybe other languages need 4, an additional input value for gender, right? So we essentially create a contract saying, hey, what's everything you're going to need to create this localized piece of content, right? What's all the data you need? So we create sort of a data model for that content. And then, of course, we just generate lots of Java stuff for that, right? So we've also created a lot of editors. And I've been talking about content. This is what our content editor looks like, right? So it lets you edit a contract. And then for a particular contract, you could have 1 or more bundles. We always, by default, create an English US bundle, right? So that's always our fallback in case there's There's no other localization occurs. We have at least one language. And from this editor, you can edit both the contract itself and add bundles to it. Right, so typically, non-programmers are going to would use this for bundles, right? They don't care about what the code is, what the Java code is here. Behind the scenes, actually, our contracts are XML files, right? And they don't want to edit XML either, right? These are people who are translating stuff. We also have a really nice JavaScript editor that we're working on currently that's not, I was hoping it might be ready for this presentation, but it's not quite ready. I mentioned how we capture a lot of metadata about JavaScript, a lot of sort of static typing that you would have in Java. We also do things like dependency management like you do in Java. So you can imagine like you do an import statement in Java. We have a needs statement, right, to make sure that any JavaScript you need is going to be present. And so combining all these things with Eclipse has led us to create a really amazing JavaScript editor, an IDE that gives you, if you can imagine everything that doing Java development has in Eclipse, we have it in JavaScript now. Or we have it very, very soon. We also have a lot of what I call visual explorers. Right? So I mentioned how we take images and links, we turn those into Java classes. So we literally, every night, we have a build system that looks in our source code trees. It looks at all the images and looks at metadata files for all of our links and generates a giant Java jar with Java classes for everything in there. But there's a lot, and eBay is a very big site. And so finding things can be tricky. So we created some more Eclipse plugins, some visual explorers. So we have explorers for images, right, where you can sort of browse through and do searches through those jars. Right? It'll show you all the images. It'll show you localized versions of the images if they exist. Right? In many cases, a particular image, we want to localize it for different countries. Same thing for links. Right? So again, you can find all these different links. And when you find all these links, you can just right-click and copy it, and it'll copy all the Java information you're going to need to use in your code. We also have a very interesting application model, right, that is kind of similar to JSF. If you're familiar with JSF, if you can imagine JSF where you were kind of able to create your own phases and your own life cycles, however you saw fit, that's kind of similar to what our application model is like. And so we have another Eclipse plugin we wrote for sort of visualizing the application model, visualizing the application, what are the different requests into the application. For each one of those requests, what kind of parameters does it take? And making everything as Java has allowed us to create a really rich component model. So a visual component for us is it's a Java class, of course, but it's able to tell you everything it needs, right? So if it needs CSS, if it needs JavaScript, if it needs localized content, again, it just refers to the Java classes that represent each one of those things, right? So this has allowed us to have tremendous reuse of code across our site. I'm going to show you guys a picture later of one of our web pages decomposed into components, right? And so we have a very rich library of components that we're able to reuse. And we also have an Eclipse plugin for browsing and searching through components and visualizing those components. We also have lots of wizards. I mentioned our application model, right? So in our application model, there's different types of applications. Is it going to be a single-page application, a multi-page application? And then depending on what you pick, there's different things you're going to need to create for the application, different artifacts you need, which that could be a lot to deal with, a lot of things to remember. Okay, I did a multi-page thing, so I need to create this particular class to manage the state of the multi-page flow, right? So we have wizards, again, so that you just kind of answer. It's a typical wizard. It's like a questionnaire. You can answer, is it 1 page, 2 page, what kind of parameters, what kind of requests, and it creates a skeleton, and then you just kind of fill in things. So when we really created V4, our focus was on addressing a lot of sort of holistic, large-scale problems, right? Making sure we can manage things like, content and JavaScript and CSS in a better way. And we've seen huge gains from that. We've seen, tremendous drop in our bug numbers. Our QA cycles have shortened quite a bit, right? But with having all these, creating all this Java code around things, Java being a very very verbose language. We're very worried about developer productivity. So we've created a lot of plugins, as I've shown. We also did some more clever things. One of them is something that we call dervlets. The D in dervlet is sort of for Darwin, like evolution. You know, very full of ourselves with that, I think. But so this is a real Java class, right? And it's really just one method with one single line of code. And in our system, you can take this and run it. Right? You can run this as a dervlet. It'll start an embedded web server for you. It'll bring up a browser, whatever your default browser is on your system, with that web page loaded automatically, right? So there's no Tomcat or JBoss or anything like that to start and stop and deal with. There's no deployment to worry about. You can just take any piece of code and right-click on it, and you don't even have to have any kind of interface here. So there's no interface. There's no annotations. There's nothing here saying, oh, this is a dervlet, right? You can just right-click on any class and run it as a dervlet, right? So this really helps with productivity, right? You can really, especially if what you're doing is concentrating on the presentation side of things, you can create things and test things very, very rapidly. So another productivity tool we came up with is something called Spyglass. So on the left for you guys, that's the My eBay page. That's the beta version of it that you can go to right now. And I've enabled this thing called Spyglass. And Spyglass, it shows basically everything that's in a red box is a component in our system, right? And each one of these guys, you can click on them, and you get all kinds of options of what you can do with that component. So in this case, this member badge, very, very common PCC on lots of eBay pages, right? It's actually a fairly complicated little piece of machinery there to figure out what numbers to show, what color star to show. But this gets reused everywhere, and you can essentially, from your browser, from Firefox, from Internet Explorer, click on it, and you get lots of choices, but the third one is what's most interesting. Open in Eclipse, right? So back in a developer's Eclipse machine, they have another option called Start Your Embedded Server. This is a listener server that's going to listen for essentially HTTP requests that's going to allow you to go back and forth from a live web page, right into Eclipse. So you could see something on the page. Maybe you get a bug filed against you saying, okay, this one component's got some problem. You can go to that page, right? You can bring up Spyglass, and you can go directly to the real code in Eclipse right there. Now, of course, you can't access Spyglass just anywhere. I couldn't do a live demo of this. It has to be within an IP domain owned by eBay for us to enable Spyglass. We don't own Google, so I couldn't use it here, but very useful for developers. Okay, so I kind of talked about our architecture. So I'll talk a little bit about our organization. eBay, like every startup, we started very, very small, but now we're not so small. We have about 15,000, 16,000 people in many, many countries. We have 2 big offices here. We have offices in a very large development center in China, another one in India, some in the UK, and Germany. So anytime your organization grows bigger and bigger, that can cause you a lot of stress, right? It becomes much harder to do development when you have 2 guys here in San Jose working with 2 guys in China and 1 guy in Germany. And when you have lots of people writing lots of code, inevitably you get lots of dependencies, right? So you can imagine any large code base is going to have lots of dependencies, and we have a very large code base. eBay rolls our entire site every 2 weeks, and we roll a couple million lines of code every 2 weeks. And so as you can imagine, there's a tremendous number of interdependencies that occur. So between organization and dependencies, you get a lot of complexity, right? And it can be really hard to manage things, and that can really, really hurt developer productivity, hurt everyone's productivity. So again, when it comes to managing complexity, we turn to Eclipse. So on this screen, this is the Package Explorer in Eclipse, probably very familiar to you guys. Each one of those are projects. So this was a very small workspace for eBay standards that I was working on, right? It was actually only changing kernel code, like very low-level infrastructure code, right? So most of our product developers, they're going to deal with all this code and then a whole lot more application and domain-specific code as well, right? And you can see just the number of projects here, right? I can only get down into DA, right? I mean, that's not very far, right? This is a long scroll box of lots and lots and lots of projects, and there's lots of dependencies between all these different projects. I mean, could you imagine having to set all this up yourself in Eclipse, right? I mean, good luck. So we have a build system, as you might guess, and we have Eclipse plugins for the build system. So this is showing our little toolbar we have, right? And there's a couple different kinds of builds we have, but this guy is the one that's most fun. And you kind of see it says, this one does it all. If you click on it, this is what you get. So this single build is essentially going to not just build all the code, but it's going to create all the Eclipse projects and create all the dependencies between all the Eclipse projects, and then import them all into your workspace so you're ready to work, right? So with one click, your development environment is set up. Now, it takes a while after you click that, as you might guess. But still. So I mentioned all these different projects and all the dependencies you have between them. So again, we created another Eclipse plugin for managing these dependencies, right? So this is just showing one particular project and then all the projects it depends on, and then for each one of those projects, what projects do they depend on, right? And so we actually save all this information into a very lightweight XML format, right? That you can imagine the most lightweight translation of XML is this, and that's pretty much what we save things as. But that lets us create all these Eclipse projects for people automatically. Okay, so having lots and lots and lots of code means having lots and lots of code in Eclipse. And I love Eclipse, but Eclipse uses a lot of memory just by itself. And when you load in, millions of lines of code and thousands of classes, and you start doing, Control-Shift-T so you can search for things, there's a lot of stuff gets loaded into memory, right? So you can see this is an Eclipse INI file, right, where we're saying we're going to start this guy with a gig of memory and give it up to 2 gigs of memory and give it up a gig of permgen space, right? So this is actually, a very typical thing for us. But believe it or not, that's not enough sometimes for us. Sometimes even giving Eclipse 2 gigs of memory, we'll still get out of memory errors from Eclipse. So we worked on lightening our load, right? Some way to make it where we could deal with lots and lots of code in Eclipse without needing 10 gigabytes of memory to do it. And we came up with something we call mega jars. So for a given project, if you're working on my eBay or if you're working on one particular application in eBay, you're going to need hundreds of thousands, millions of lines of code, thousands and thousands of classes. But chances are what you're actually going to be changing yourself is a pretty small subset of that, right? So when you're working from a source code repository, you're going to check everything out, bring everything into your workspace. But with mega jars, we essentially have a way of saying, okay, what do I actually need to change, and what can this be read-only, right? And whatever is read-only, we'll create one big mega jar for it on the fly, right? We'll attach the source code to that jar file, and then we'll reconfigure all of your projects in Eclipse to refer to that jar instead of individual source code, right? So because the source code's still attached, you still get, all the being able to see Java doc and whatnot inside Eclipse. You can even, control click on one of those classes that's in that jar, and it'll show you the code for it. You just can't change the code, right? So this has been I think it's been a great boon for us. When I first wrote the articles for IBM, the guy who actually wrote our Megajars plugin, he was like, "Oh, Megajars is just a Band-Aid," right? And it's still, if you have, we still need a gigabyte of memory for Eclipse, but it's still, it's a lot better. So, okay, so we kind of have some essentials, right, at eBay, things that all of our developers are going to use. And one of the most useful one is an auto configuration plugin. right? So I've been showing mostly plugins we wrote for V4 for this presentation architecture we have. We have a lot of other stuff, a lot of other code base. It's not just presentation code. And we have a lot of other Eclipse plugins. So we have a very interesting data access layer that is a JPA implementation, if you're familiar with JPA, where we've added a lot of things on top of JPA to make it more scalable. And we have a lot of Eclipse plugins for that. And we have other systems as well that I probably don't even know about that have Eclipse plugins. And sometimes just figuring out what Eclipse plugins you're going to need, that became a headache too, right? And then dealing with versioning, right? So as we're changing sort of framework code, we also might need to evolve our plugins, right? So making sure that you have the right version of the plugin to go with your framework code, that became hard too, right? So it came with this auto configuration where it'll inspect all the code in your workspace and figure out what plugins you need and what versions you need, and then change your Eclipse to install the appropriate plugins. We also use a lot of plugins that we didn't write. One of my favorites is Find Bugs. And Find Bugs does a really good job of finding bugs. And yeah, so it's surprising how many things that this guy will catch, right? And developers use it. Our QA uses it as well as another line of defense to make sure, potentially, bad things that may not get caught in testing don't make it out to production. We've customized Find Bugs quite a bit by adding our own rules to it. We use ClearCase for our source code management. Obviously, there are a lot of, depending on what kind of source code management you're using, there's a lot of great plugins out there for integrating with Eclipse. ClearCase has an excellent plugin. And we use the WebTools project, WebTools platform. I always forget what the P stands for, right? So we deploy it to Apache Geronimo. So when you use our plugins, we automatically create a Geronimo server for you, right? So that when you're ready to deploy to a server and really test out your code in a production-ish environment, then you don't have to set up a server for you or anything like that. And that is the end. So I think I have a little while for questions. If folks want to ask questions. Over there?
You guys use Gwt?
Pardon me?
You use Gwt, GWT?
No, we do not. No, I do not. Okay. We yeah, we do. When it comes to Ajax, we do a fair amount, and we're doing a little bit more as time goes on of Java to JavaScript translation, right? However, in our experience, if you create a lot of your UI, if you create it completely in JavaScript, right, and then on the client render it like that, it's very slow, right? The JavaScript itself in Gwt is not slow, but just creating the UI itself, right? Just it's much faster if you want to create a text box to create an HTML and pump that to the browser.
Do you mean generating the JavaScript?
Right. It's not the JavaScript part that's slow. It's the way the browser interprets the JavaScript, right? So if you do straight DOM on that, that's the most horribly slow thing you can do. If you just create a big string and tell it, oh, enter HTML this, here's this big string, it's a little bit faster. But if you know what the HTML is going to look like on the server and you pump that HTML to the browser, it's going to be much faster than using JavaScript for it. So we do like some of the things in Gwt, and we have some things that are kind of similar, but we would never use it, at least not with the current set of browsers out there today.
For the servlets, the way I understood, you can highlight a bunch of code and then run it. So that implies there's an implicit container and that's an implicit component. How do you do that? Is there kind of like an aspect-oriented wrapper around that? Or?
So actually, any class, you can right-click on the class. Maybe my example was back, and I showed it kind of over there in the editor. You could go over on the Package Explorer and right-click on the class. And essentially what our plugin looks for is a class that has a single method that produces what we call a dnode, right? So this is going to become a node in an HTML DOM, right? So again, we don't use any HTML, right? We don't use any JSPs. We use everything in Java. Right? So you look at eBay.com, that was all a Java class at one point. So we have a DOM style approach to it. So we take a class and say, okay, does it have one thing that produces a node? If it does, then does it produce a whole HTML document? Okay, maybe it doesn't do that. So if it doesn't produce that, then we can just create, a head and a body around things, right? And then create, the sort of decorate it to create a full HTML document, right? So that way you can just write, a very minimal amount of code, just whatever is interesting to you, and you can immediately run it and look at it.
Like standard in and standard out in some sense.
Yeah.
Separate question, about Spyglass. Are you injecting stuff into the HTML stream within your network in order to do that highlighting, or is that already there and you make it visible through CSS?
Yeah, that's right. We inject some CSS and some JavaScript, right? We don't inject it in our network. It's just that when our servers are going to send out the respond to a request, they know if it comes from our internal network or not, right? And so they will enable or disable this one extra step of adding this stuff on the server itself, right? But based on where the IP address is. In the very back?
Yeah, two questions. Have you done any user studies that are asked developers how they like your tools? And the second question is, are you planning on open sourcing?
Two very good questions. Yeah, so the first question was, have we done any user studies or asked developers how they like the tools? Is that right? Okay. And then the second question was, are we planning on open sourcing it? So the first question, yes, we've done exhaustive surveys and study groups with developers. And developers are just like anybody else, right? You put something new in front of them and you ask them, what do you think? Right? They're going to immediately give you 20 things they hate about it, right? And that's fantastic, right? Because you can immediately address their pain points, figure out, okay, so we've done a lot of cycles around improving the framework itself and improving the tools around the framework to help developer productivity. Open sourcing, the answer is yes. We want very much to open source it. We don't have any definite dates yet, but it is our desire. We make use of a lot of open source technologies. I mean, obviously, Eclipse. When I mentioned the whole running things as servlets, we're using Jetty as an embedded servlet container. And it is our great desire to give back to the open source community. I wish I could tell you that, yes, this is all going to be available through open source tomorrow, but I'm not Steve Jobs. So it is our intention to open source everything I've shown here today. Yeah.
How do you deal with organization-wide deployment? It looks like some of it is done with your automatic configuration feature, but how else do you deal with large-scale deployment? Yeah,
so our variant of Eclipse we call the EDE, the eBay Development Environment, and essentially we have an internal website. You just type in EDE, and it has an installer, right? And you run the installer. It installs the right JVM that's going to be used. It's our production JVM. It installs Eclipse, installs all the plugins, all the default plugins, right? Like find bugs and WTP and things like that. And then so that gives you Eclipse up and running. It also sets things like your heap size, so that way you don't run out of memory so easily. And we integrate with ClearCase, so it's going to find ClearCase on your system and do all kinds of good stuff like that. And then once you're running Eclipse and you have some code that in your workspace, then you can do the auto configuration tool to get additional plugins that are specific to whatever kind of development you're doing. So we try to make it as painless as possible, because if developers are wasting a lot of time on configuring their tools, I mean, that's just a terrible thing, right? And then it also gives you this, big friction where you don't want to make your tools any better, because that means developers have to go through and get the new tools and deal with figuring out the new tools, right? And we want to make our tools better, so we try to make it, very, very, very seamless for folks. It's not always perfect, but we try very hard. Any more questions? One here?
What are your regrets in adopting Eclipse, like in terms of pain points? What have you guys hit? There's been a lot of praise, but what's killing you on the inside?
So any negatives around using Eclipse? I mean,
what could be better, I guess, is the better way to say it.
if its memory footprint was smaller, if we could load a couple million classes and it didn't that didn't create such a resource drain on things. I mean, those would be nice, but I'm not sure if there's a whole lot you can do around that. I don't know. I mean, we're really quite happy with things. I mean, we've over the years kind of grown a bigger and bigger organization that's just devoted to creating more and more internal tools for us, right? Because we've seen such a great trade-off between if we can have a couple developers write a couple tools, then that just helps thousands of developers in our company. Right over there, I think. Yeah.
So, it sounds like your strategy has been, in a way, to abandon domain-specific languages like CSS in favor of Java, but then I see that you let people write CSS and then you generate to Java. Does that mean that that seems to suggest that some people are still writing CSS, and if that's the case, then do you support a round trip? In other words, if someone makes a change in the Java that's been generated, can that go back to the CSS so that someone can stay in the domain-specific language world?
Good question. So for each one of our different things I showed up there, one of our big principles is having a single source of truth, right? So for anything, for CSS, for JavaScript, for content, there's always exactly one single source of truth. There may be other things that are generated from it, but those things we don't check in, for example, right? There's only ever one source of truth, so that way you don't have to keep things synchronized. And that varies a little bit depending on what you're talking about. For CSS, we've abandoned CSS completely, right? You mentioned domain-specific languages. We actually have what we consider our own domain-specific language that we've written on top of Java for doing CSS, right? It gives you all the syntax of CSS where you can, any kind of selector you can imagine writing in CSS, you could write in our language. But it's also object-oriented and allows for inheritance and allows for localization, things that are hard to do normally in CSS. So we have the code generator because for a lot of folks, it's easier to write a prototype and use normal CSS first. And people are still learning things, right? And we didn't want to tell people, hey, forget CSS, here's our Java version of things. You have to just learn this and go cold turkey, right? So we gave people the ability to take an existing CSS file and generate sort of sort of kickstart their development, right? Bootstrap it, right? We don't check any CSS files into our system. In fact, our code management system won't let you check in a CSS file, right? If it's a .css file, it'll give you an error when you do a check-in. When we generate the code for it, we do use Java docs to show you what the real CSS was going to look like, right? So at any time you could go and scrape that, right, and dump it into a CSS file and regenerate and do round trips if you wanted to, that way. But our intention is to let people just use it as an initial bootstrap. For the other thing that's kind of similar is JavaScript. In JavaScript, we didn't try to replace JavaScript. We actually like JavaScript quite a bit. It's a great functional programming language, right? We created extra metaprogramming on top of it to allow sort of Java proxies for JavaScript, right? Where I can create a button on a page and I can, associate a JavaScript event handler, and everything is strongly typed in Java, right? But in that case, we keep the JavaScript around. It has this extra metaprogramming inside of it, and we don't. All the Java code is generated by our build system, but we don't. But it's throwaway code, right? It's just generated stuff. So we take a little different approach depending on what type of technology it is. But in each case, there's only one source of truth.
Kind of related to that about the domain-specific languages. Whenever I've seen, people try to generate, say, HTML from Java code, and they'll, have, dot table, blah, blah, blah. What I'm saying is it can be very verbose compared to the domain-specific language, whether it's CSS or HTML, which is concise and easy to understand. So how do you get around the problem?
Right.
of writing Java code.
Right. So we have a full DOM implementation, right? And you could go the DOM route, but we recognized early on that DOM programming is generally very painful, right? Not painful. It's not complicated, but it's very verbose. A lot of stuff to write. A lot of document, create elements, and append childs, and all this stuff, right? So we created extensions on top of all that especially for HTML classes. And again, we created what we considered another DSL on top of Java for doing HTML, where if you use our DSL, it looks almost exactly like the HTML, like line by line, right? So we have a lot of cases where if you're adding, maybe you have a div and you add something to the div, what gets returned by that add is the same div, right? So you can kind of do this cascading style to make it look just like the HTML looks, right? So that we never wanted people to have an excuse of saying, oh, I like the other way better because there's less stuff to write, right? So our Java code looks very similar to HTML code.
Is there one more quick question? Because we're going to have to cut it off. Quick. Michael, you can be around for the rest of the day? Or?
Yeah.
So there'll be time for...
Yeah, since there is a lot of code and each developer must be working on different pieces of the website, does each developer's workspace in Eclipse look similar, or do you manage to have packages which a developer can only do in his Eclipse?
Yeah, so the question was do each developer's workspaces look very similar in Eclipse? So we're using clear case, right, source code management. So usually for a given project, there'll be a view spec, right, which is what parts of the code do you need for this particular project, and that'll be shared by people. And so anybody working on that same project, that same view, it'll look very similar, right? And if they use the auto configuration stuff, even their tools will look very similar, right? So I mean, if for some reason you and a colleague, if your computer's not working one day, you go over to his computer, and everything will be set up very similarly. I mean, of course, there could be some minor differences, but if you had two people who had very different projects they're working on, then the code in their workspace could be a lot different, and even their plugins might be quite a bit different. So yes and no.
Okay, I'm going to cut it off there. Thank you, Michael. It was very interesting.